From the Psych Hub Podcast Network, welcome to Coming Back Better, a podcast sponsored by HCA Healthcare and in collaboration with Columbia University Department of Psychiatry.
And it's been a theme through all of these episodes on Coming Back Better. There are things that maybe were long overdue, and we needed the disruption to pause long enough to say, yeah, maybe I need to put some time and effort into this.
Paul, that's exactly it. We were in the grind. We didn't even think about it. We didn't have the capacity to say, hey, are you lonely? It didn't pop up. We didn't think about that before. There's no possible way people are all of a sudden lonely. Our grandparents have been in that situation long before the pandemic. It just exacerbated it.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Coming Back Better. I'm Marjorie Morrison, and I am here today with my co-host, Paul Deger.
Hey, Marjorie. Good to be back.
I was going to say who has the best voice of calm that there is, and a perfect one to tackle this tough concept of loneliness.
Oh, yeah. I'm just thinking about, as a therapist and how loneliness can just wreak havoc and hardship in someone's life. So I'm really glad we're talking about this today.
Loneliness, a topic that we can all relate to, because I don't think there was a single person, even just pre-pandemic, in pandemic, post-pandemic, that can't relate to what loneliness feels like. I'm fascinated about just these conversations around what you do with people who are used to going into an office. All of a sudden, you lock everybody in. You have everybody show up to work on their computers or go to school on their computers, and just thinking about what that does to loneliness and just how much we now know about the human need to be together, to be around people for ourselves and for each other, right? And just all of the different things that we get from being around each other. And when you're not around people, how it can really have increased rates of depression, anxiety, substance use, and all the things that, I think it makes sense, right? We understand why people could be anxious and why anxiety rose, and we didn't know what was going to happen. Depression, you feel isolated, you're scared. And then, of course, killing time with substance use and alcohol and making cocktails and drinking and smoking or whatever it is, the vice. I think all of that really, really fed into ways to deal with loneliness.
In developed countries, the share of people who report having friends or relatives they can count on has been steadily dropping over the past 15 years.
As COVID-19 forces us to physically distance from one another, society is at risk of a social recession. A social recession is marked by an increase in loneliness and isolation.
Between 11 and 12 million people, 28% of those over the age of 65 are right now living alone. The National Council on Aging says socially isolated seniors are more likely to predict their quality of life will get worse over the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, Marjorie, during the early days of the pandemic, I was doing telehealth and talking to folks who were used to going to an office to work and how that was all ripped away. And it was just, the pain was evident. No one didn't have any time to prepare for this change and just feeling the effects. So this was a huge sort of rampant issue during the pandemic.
Yeah, and it affected every age group, right? I mean, Every single age group could know what it was like or could experience loneliness.
Mm-hmm.
And every age group, whether it's school age or young adults, every one of them, every age, could really understand what it's like to be isolated and not around their friends. And this time, Paul, I had a chance to listen to our first story from Maria. I felt really moved by her, a 90-year-old woman who's going to share with us basically what it was like with her life with her husband of being isolated. And I do just want to say she is Spanish as a first language. And so she worked hard to be able to do this in English. But I really think that it's a moving story.
All right, let's hear Maria's story.
Hello, I am Maria and I am 90 years old. My husband and I were living alone during the pandemic. Because of our age, we didn't leave our house for almost 2 years. Our daughter was coming, visiting us whenever she could. We are original from Colombia, so we have been communicating with friends and family over the phone for many years. Our family traveled to visit us every year. Because of the pandemic, our family couldn't come to visit us, and they were hesitant and they kept their distance. I would talk to my friends from Texas and Florida over the phone. They were around my age and my husband. Being at home, I had the news on all day, and it was intense hearing all about the death in the news. It was a hard time for me. I was used to going out, browsing the shops, get my hair done, just feeling free. And how my husband's hearing loss did not help, because I couldn't talk with him, and of course that made me feel more alone. I felt very lonely, even though we have people helping us. We tried to distract ourselves watching TV. Our connection to others was the phone. I had already been feeling lonely since before the pandemic because my family lives far away and my friends, some of them are no longer with us. The pandemic showed us that we needed help, and with the help of our family, we decided to go to senior living. We moved to senior living. We are more relaxed and less alone. We have people with us all day, and we don't have to worry about anything. Our family visit us. Getting old is not easy, but having family and friends and help makes of being different.
Oh my goodness, my heart was just tugged at listening to Maria, and I'm so glad that in the end, it's like this is a woman of resilience to hear how she took that big, scary step with her husband to make the move into senior living.
I'm glad that they did it. It just does sound like she felt pretty isolated.
I used to do home health with seniors, and so much of her story rang true about the news on all day. And in how, in this case, it was talking about COVID and how it was her group, her population of elders that was really taking the hit. So just I could see where that constant news was just draining and taking away. God love her. She would go out to get her hair done and go shopping before the pandemic, and how that was all ripped away as well. Hearing how elders really took a particular hit during the pandemic.
I wonder because there was in the beginning, there were so many issues with people dying in senior homes. I was curious, and she didn't really talk about it, but if that was a concern of theirs or if they just felt like they needed to be around other people. Did you get a sense?
Yeah, I think it's a great question because they were isolated when they lived in their own home, but they also weren't in these nursing homes or these senior living communities that were getting kind of scary. I wonder how that factored in to make that decision. of, do we leave in some ways the safety of our home? What's going to be more of a negative to us, the isolation or going into a community? And I'm hearing in the end, the choice was a community is the way to go.
People are so resilient. It's amazing, isn't it?
Her line, "Getting old is not easy." I mean, she's a tough one, and she figured it out. So I've got an interview to share with you with Amy Perlman. Amy is a licensed independent clinical social worker in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, has a Master of Social Work from Smith College. Her expertise is in community and mobile crisis intervention with individuals and families. She supports an integrated vision of healthcare throughout all community facets. And as we talk about community, I think a social worker perspective is really going to be helpful.
I'm actually really interested in what they have to say, and I could only imagine how much extra work it had to be for social workers during that time, which is interesting because we don't really think about it as much as we do nurses,
Yeah.
doctors, and whatnot. Let's take a listen.
Hey, Amy, good to have you here today.
Thanks, Paul. It's really nice to be here and to talk about loneliness. And the other part of loneliness that I really want to highlight is community. So I'm happy to be part of your community today
I love that.
and really think about how we can all increase our sense of community.
Cool. All right. I love this idea of community. Let's explore that theme today as well, and recognizing that we have a community of listeners that we're hanging out with today. So, Amy, we just had a chance to listen to Maria, and I got to say, my heart was just so touched listening to her story. And so I'm curious, what did you notice or what stood out to you listening to Maria's story?
I loved hearing Maria's story, partly because it really pulled out some things that resonate for so many different people, individuals, and families. And I thought she was able to use a short period of time to make several points that we could all relate to. The one I really wanted to start with was this difference between being alone and feeling lonely.
Yeah, agree.
And I think it was really the being versus the feeling in that
Okay.
component.
Yeah.
So I think that Maria is someone who had a lot of experience with being alone, but also with finding that connection. And it seemed like that connection had started to
Okay.
change pre-pandemic, but that it really increased with this idea of social isolation, where being alone and being kind of physically distant from not just your family, as she had immigrated to the United States. So her family was at quite a distance, but also her community, her local. She mentioned several small activities, getting her hair done, seeing people in shops. And we all have those. Mine is the coffee shop. So I really like thinking about going in and seeing the same faces and those small moments of connection. Missing those is really what sounded to me like kind of flipped from being alone to feeling that sense of loneliness. And the feeling is what really brings us that sense of pain or suffering.
So being alone is more like the physical distance, but the loneliness is more of a felt sense, I think I'm hearing you say?
That is the way that I experience it and the way that I describe it to others.
Okay, that's really helpful in that she did have a really good routine going. And like so many other things we've talked about on Coming Back Better, it was disrupted.
And I really feel like we all have different standards or different kind of criteria of what we need in terms of alone time. There are some
Okay.
people who really thrive with having a lot of time to themselves, and other people who really thrive by being around other people all of the time. There are also people who are around other people all the time that still feel lonely.
Say more about that. I think it's a real important point to understand.
I think it's really this internal component. The way I have heard this a lot with people I talk to is that when you're in a group, even and there's lots of people around, if you're not feeling understood or not feeling heard, you can still have that feeling of loneliness when you're not actually alone.
So it's not directly related to other people. It's more so the behavior or the engagement with other people, not necessarily the presence of other people.
And one of the things that stood out as an example from Maria's story is that her husband, who was the person she was spending all of her time with, was experiencing hearing loss. And that is not just this idea of feeling heard or feeling understood. she literally was not being heard.
Right. And felt the pain of that. Yeah.
And that impact is a little bit of a component of grief and loss. You think about loss of hearing, what that was like for her husband, but also what it was like for her to have that loss of a sounding board or the loss of physically being heard in her home.
Right. So many compounding factors that sort of a perfect storm during the pandemic that she experienced.
And those are all of the pieces that I felt like, I mean, there's so many of these little tidbits that she put into such a short story, even though the experience, it was not short.
No, it was fully packed. And you've got my mind spinning now, speaking of fully packed with just this whole topic of loneliness. And you brought up the idea of this people on the continuum of introversion to extroversion. And I'm wondering about the difference between healthy alone time and when it maybe start to be a cause for concern. Can you speak to that?
I would mark it as a change in behavior or a change in feeling.
Ah,
So I think
okay.
we all had change in behaviors during the pandemic that, made sense in context. But when people are, if it is someone who is really used to spending all of their time around a lot of people and then starts to withdraw, I think that's an area where it becomes something that is of concern. I also think this idea of who would you talk to if you had a problem? If people can answer that question, and I think we all know from our own experience, some people would say, I have a list of one or two people, and other people would say, I used to say I have my own phone book, but in the digital age, like maybe my contacts are maxed out.
As you talk about that, and I'm wondering if we do see someone who is experiencing a change, how can we reach out and help them and also be respectful of boundaries? I'm curious about that balance.
I think it's really this sense of reminders that someone is there without pressure to connect. And in the digital age, I think that this is a lot of like a text message to say, hey, was thinking about you so that people remember they have that connection. I think there has also been, you think about the change in terms of isolation, but I think there's also been a reintegration component as well. So people have really gotten used to being more socially isolated. And the more we can support each other in reintegrating, I think this is something that has come up with, we're seeing across the board some increased anxiety. And a lot of that anxiety comes around this type of social interaction where it may have come easily to someone in the past. I think continuing to try to connect for people who are experiencing loneliness, I like to think about taking smaller steps. So something like going to the coffee shop and making a connection with someone who may be in your community, but not super close. I think it's really this component of feeling like making smaller steps to reintegrate because we had a very sudden withdrawal, right? So that kind of lockdown, it was very abrupt. And I think really easing into this and creating the space for smaller connections is what I would recommend to individuals and to keep trying to the people that support them.
With the pandemic and that sudden change, yeah, that was hard. And also with disruption, there's opportunity. And how that the pandemic became a catalyst, maybe for changes that were needed long before. So I'm curious about your thoughts about that in Maria's story.
I really loved that Maria was able to tell a story that had a happy ending. She
Right. Yeah.
came
Yeah.
out of the pandemic living in a community again, and that community felt a little bit different. And I think that when you look at the aging process in general, that's a hard change to make. And I really could see how the pandemic was a benefit for her because she could see that need for change more quickly or more clearly, maybe, than she could have if there wasn't this abrupt social isolation. That highlighting of the need for change really pulled her into a better place because I think this is something that many older adults deal with as you look at the physical components with hearing loss, or Maria mentioned that she was going through grief and loss with losing some of her friends. So as her community is decreasing, really being able to think about, what does community mean to me now that I am aging, when my family may be farther away or my friends may be passing away, and I'm not able to do as much, get out and do as much stuff as I would do independently as I did when I was younger. So the idea of community really changes over time. And I thought that Maria made some really intentional changes that were for the best. I loved seeing that. I was happy to see her in a good place, or hear her in a good place.
So, what are other final thoughts on elders and loneliness and community?
Loneliness is something that most of us can relate to, but really keeping an eye on this, knowing for ourselves as we age, but knowing that as we look at older adults in the community, that their idea of community changes, their physical community changes, their social community changes, and being cognizant and compassionate about that. So I think it's these same components, Paul, that we talked about in building a community around loneliness in any setting or for any person or family. I think that it is especially evident with or without COVID, just because of the way aging works, that older adults are feeling that increased loneliness, that change that we were talking about. I also think that change is more gradual, so it sometimes isn't as noticed. And I really encourage communities to look out for each other in the sense of being aware of what the experience is like. We each know what our own experience is, but I felt like Maria really highlighted what the experience of older adults are as they continue to age and continue to experience more and more loneliness.
I love this notion about the difference of being alone and
Yeah.
feeling lonely. And I think that's so true. They are very different, and you can be alone and not feel lonely. And you can feel lonely when you're with people. So loneliness is really more of a feeling rather than what's actually happening. It makes me sad to think about when you're feeling alone. It really brings us that pain and that suffering. Yet at the same time, there are people that really thrive on being alone. That also changes. Like as time goes on, things change right within ourselves. Sometimes we really want to be around people, and other times we don't. And that's okay.
Yeah, I think it's an important distinction for checking in of, am I feeling the need for some time alone, which can be beneficial, or am I finding myself feeling like something's missing? And what do I need to do about that?
I think it's another one of these things that all of us can relate to. And I also go back to, the conversation earlier about what people will do to avoid the feeling of loneliness, the void that we'll do, whether it's substance use or feel anxious or just kind of isolate and get depressed because it's just, you don't really realize what it is that's triggering that.
And this idea of one of the solutions for loneliness is community, but how the pandemic in some ways ripped away community. But then we got creative. I actually had someone I used to work with who'd set up one of those pods, the safe people to stay in the bubble with, and how there was some really creative thought and intentionality brought into building community when we lost the usual ways of doing it. So, speaking of community, I have another expert to share with you, Marjorie. Dr. Bita Rivas, who we heard in the relationships episode, she's back again talking about loneliness. And she had some interesting thoughts about community and about being introverted or extroverted, and really a good understanding of this alone versus lonely.
Oh, I'm looking forward to it. Let's take a listen.
Well, welcome back. It's so good to have you again, Dr. Rivas, for another topic, and this time on loneliness. And we heard from Maria. So, first thoughts on listening to Maria's story.
It is so wonderful to be back. Thank you for having me back. So, for Maria, one of the first things I thought is it's even more challenging when you've immigrated to this country. That's a layer that she talked about, having family members outside of this country, that I thought was just another challenge to her case in particular. The other thing that I really heard is that having moved into a community, an elderly community, really helped. And just being able to just kind of walk out and talk to people and have that be part of your day was a huge part of it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I'm wondering in general, because I'm thinking back to the early days of the pandemic and how elders or seniors are most at risk. And wondering how did that impact their experience when it came to isolation and loneliness? And how did the pandemic make things even more complicated for them?
I think one part of the complication was that we didn't really have an awful lot of time devoted to visiting our family to begin with. I mean, everyone was working. If you had elderly family, I think a lot of family members struggled at even getting that time. While one part of what happened in the pandemic was highlighting that, the challenge was actually accessing them. You could potentially be getting them sick, whether it was they're at home or in a community. That was a consideration, is that they're vulnerable and susceptible to the virus or any cold. Maria's story, and really talking about how she really needed the phone or used the phone and just needed that contact. That's what I think we all relied on, is let me at least get on the phone with them. Even past Maria, we all kind of had this realization that we need to make contact somehow. I think we became a little bit more aware of our community too.
Yeah.
Like, are there elderly people in the neighborhood? Do they need any support? Do they need help? That awareness doesn't mean that we are able to take any action. I think that's a challenge now, is what do we do to make this connection with people who are still feeling isolated, whether it's
Right.
physically isolated or just emotionally isolated? I think that's the challenge we're at right now, is how do we know you're feeling lonely?
It does make me start to wonder about this idea of loneliness compared to healthy alone time. How do we differentiate that? And when do we start to see there's some cause for concern that maybe I need to reach out to someone?
I've been thinking about that myself. Like, where is that line? Because you're right that, are you an extroverted introvert? Are you a lot more introverted and it really does drain you? But on any scale and any part of that spectrum, we need people. And we are not well when we're not around people, at least with some quality relationships. How we know that we're starting to hit that what's unhealthy usually comes in the form of kind of mental health cues. Are we drinking too much? Is that I don't want to see people, like I just want my space, or is I don't want to see people kind of anhedonia, like I just don't even find meaning in it anymore. Signs of depression are setting in. So those are the cues, I would say.
I think what I hear you saying is, am I moving away or towards is a good indicator. And so if healthy alone time is, I need to fill myself up and I'm moving towards that, as opposed to maybe cause for concern is I'm avoiding or moving away. Is that what I'm hearing?
That's a really good line. Yes, because when we're trying to recoup and fill our cup, we know what those coping mechanisms are, right? We know, like, okay,
Okay.
I need time for me to just read a book and recoup or watch a show. Or ideally, we all kind of reflect on, what does that look like for me to refill my cup? And I think that's the first step, is knowing, what does that look like for me to refill my cup? And then at what point am I ready to revisit? We all do want relationships. Even people who are leaning introverted still have a need for quality dialogue, quality relationships, and those interactions. But you're right, that key is now I'm avoiding it, or I can't seem to fill my cup. I can't seem to get back out.
Well, you do make me think about, again, these folks who maybe were more introverted, who found a little relief. And now, with the world opening back up and there is more opportunity, maybe feeling a sense of, I forgot how to do this.
Now here we are, where we're kind of back at it, whatever that may be. We're exposed to more people at the airport, at work, at the grocery store. Traffic is back. We're in it now. And now we have to have those topical conversations
Right.
in a way that maybe we didn't with the relationships that we had. So re-engaging, we're all hitting that. Kids are hitting that in schools. How do they re-engage?
Yeah.
Not on a Google Classroom. How do we talk to each other again? It gives me another thought. So on this one part, we have so many things happening. This one area of feeling alone with a lot of people. I feel like before the pandemic, there was a lot of opportunities to feel alone with a lot of people. And then in the pandemic, we just didn't have the same access to people. Maybe on social media, but we really had to work on those quality relationships. And now it's all kind of back together again, right? Those keeping those quality relationships, but now re-engaging with work and school and other people, if that's even an option for us. And that's not even an option for individuals who are retired. That access isn't there. We have this opportunity, though, to look at what is our community and what do we want our community to be? How do we build our community? So even Maria's situation in moving into a community, an elderly community, gave her other people to be in commune with. I think that's our challenge. The world is so populated. There are a lot of people out there. We're re-engaging, but how do we find our community again?
And also, it's not one size fits all. I want to flip it to the other side because we've been talking about the person who is feeling more isolated and lonely. Maybe someone who is a little more outgoing and they are getting concerned about a friend or relative. How to approach that and still be respectful of boundaries.
To a degree, all introverts do appreciate that pushy friend that is extroverted, that gets them out of their bubble. But you bring up a really good point. We have to be more comfortable saying no and saying, I appreciate you reaching out, but today, this is my line today. This is a solid no. So I think in that, I'm hearing we just need to get a little bit better with communicating transparently with each other.
Okay, this is what I need, or I'm concerned, just being more open about it.
Being more open, because rather than changing innately who we are in our personality, what if we accepted people as we all are? But that
That'd be
requires
a wonderful world.
right. That this may be a little too idealistic, but it could happen when we are really clear on what we want from other people. The more transparent I am about saying, hey, look, that is so much energy right now. Right now I do want this time, but there are times that I do need you to help push me out of my comfort zone. This is not one of them.
Almost preempting that conversation of, let's talk about this beforehand. If you see this, this, and this, I need a push. And respect when I say, not today.
Exactly. I think one of the really neat things that has come from this time, the pandemic, the lockdown, the coming back, the weirdness, is that we're all talking about the weirdness. We're talking about what was uncomfortable and that we weren't well. None of us are 100% yet. Whether there was mental health issues ahead of time, pandemic exacerbated it. Whether we were fine, the pandemic exacerbated it. Whether we were feeling lonely to begin with, the pandemic exacerbated it. So I think one of the light coming out of this is that we're talking about it.
And it's been a theme through all of these episodes on coming back better. There are things that maybe were long overdue, and we needed the disruption to pause long enough to say, yeah, maybe I need to put some time and effort into this.
Paul, that's exactly it. We were in the grind. We didn't even think about it. We didn't have the capacity to say, hey, are you lonely? It didn't pop up. We didn't think about that before. There's no possible way people are all of a sudden lonely. Our grandparents have been in that situation long before the pandemic. It just exacerbated it.
What's your message of hope around loneliness, regardless of which side you're on it? If you're feeling lonely or you're concerned about someone else coming out of the pandemic, what's our message of hope here?
I think is let's talk about it. Let's get comfortable being uncomfortable. unabashedly, right? Unabashedly, make it weird. One of the things that makes it worse when you're feeling lonely is you don't know what to do. You don't know how to reach out. You don't know what to say. And now that you've been kind of in your self-talk for a while, you don't really know what to do. So I think that key is just do it. Just jump in. Jump into the deep end.
Marjorie, I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. You could just hear Dr. Rivas's passion around this topic and recognizing that there's so many different layers of it that we need to understand. And as we come out of the pandemic back into, again, normal, I don't know if that word fits anymore, but there are some lessons to be learned here.
Yes, for sure. Like this notion that avoidance is a sign of unhealthy loneliness. People forgot to be social, forgot how to do it because of the isolation. And it's a struggle to find communities that we fit into again, and that's okay, but you still have to try. And it's okay to have alone time to recharge. And I think that's what I always think is so interesting about the whole introversion extroversion thing, right? Everybody gets recharged differently. What you always say, I think, is one of these kind of key talking points here or key takeaways here is that letting comfortable get uncomfortable and that's okay.
And this idea of back to community, that if you feel awkward or uncertain or forgot how to be around people, so is everybody else. And so you're not alone in that. And this willingness to be in the discomfort, to be in the awkwardness, that's something we have in common right now. And so we can use that as a bridging point to learn again how to be back into community.
Yeah, it's a great point to remind ourselves that what we're feeling, good chance other people are feeling that way too.
Yeah, we're not alone. She had such a wonderful spirit about her that I found hopeful that even if we're talking about something as difficult as loneliness, there's a way out. And that way out is to reach out, whether it's I'm uncomfortable reaching out and I'm going to have the courage to do it, or I'm a little concerned about, my friend over here. I haven't heard from them. Being willing to take the risk of reaching out. Maybe they don't want to talk to me, but at least I opened the door and gave them the opportunity. Marjorie, I really feel like last week and this week, we really have given some good attention to such an important area around relationship and loneliness.
Paul, I'm excited about next week's episode when we get to talk about meditation and mindfulness. And I get to do a little bit of poking around and interviewing you because you're an expert in this. I hope you all have a great week. And I look forward to talking with you again next week when we talk about meditation.
Thanks, Marjorie. Bye, everyone. If you'd like to reach us, you can do so at podcast@psychhub.com. To be notified of new episodes, don't forget to like, subscribe, or follow wherever you're listening. And reviews are so helpful, so please do leave one if you can. It'll allow others to find us and join along. Coming Back Better is executive produced by Jacob Morrison. It is produced and edited by Juliana Castro. The series was developed in collaboration with Linda Rosenberg, Carla Cantor, and Kristen Watson from Columbia University Department of Psychiatry, and Manisha Shah, Dr. Frank Drummond, and Amy Rushton from HCA Healthcare. Research is assisted by Melissa Leaf. Show artwork was created by Arnella Jangoli and Ashton Smith. Audience strategy is by Alyssa Fackler, Sarah Hale, and Alyssa Yarama. A very special thanks to Andrea Rollback, Trevin Stegall, Evelyn Valentine, Kaylee Sneed, Julie Plummer, Thad Thomas, Paul Kay, and Elizabeth Roosevelt. Coming Back Better is a co-production from Psych Hub and Columbia University Department of Psychiatry and is brought to you by HCA Healthcare. I'm Paul Deger, and my co-host Marjorie Morrison and I thank you for joining us. See you next week.